The focus on Taiwan means, as far as Chinese defense and national security policy is concerned, that Chinese are putting their resources, most of their capabilities, into ensuring that a reunification with Taiwan becomes possible in the short to medium term. You can imagine the kind of resources that would be available to China. And you can also see how in some ways, Chinese foreign and security policy would move to other territorial disputes, including South China Sea, East China Sea, and the Himalayan borders, where India will have direct stakes, that India has its own challenges with China. And if China decides to up the ante there, then would India have the capabilities to protect and defend its interests while at the same time helping others in Taiwan? And Chinese have enough levers to play with because of their economic dominance particularly in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, where they are the largest trading partners of almost every country in the region. Taiwan crisis, if at all it happens in the way that we are envisioning, would have enormous implications for the larger global politics, but also for individual countries in the region and beyond.
How do you think India would respond to a clash between China and Taiwan? Hello and a very warm welcome to all. You're watching Hindustan Times and my name is Aisha Varma. We have our lens on India amid China-Taiwan tension, and we have a very special guest joining us today to bring us more perspective on the matter. We have Mr. Harsh Pant, the Vice President of ORF and also an International Relations Professor at King's College. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, China is slowly and steadily increasing its military presence in the Indo-Pacific, especially when it comes to the region around Taiwan. We've also been seeing the latest Mission Justice 2025, the war games that she is putting on. What do you think all of this means for India?
I think it means that China continuously wants to send out a message that there are certain core areas of Chinese interest, and there it will not buckle under pressure. The fact that Taiwan continues to be one of the core interests of China and Chinese Communist Party in making a case to the world that look, whatever is ours, we will get it back at any cost. And I think repeatedly framing it as a question of Chinese sovereignty and Chinese respect means that there are status issues linked to this, which China is in no mood to compromise. And I think the capacity, the wargaming exercises that we see is a demonstration of Chinese capabilities that are growing by the day. And Taiwan is one area where it feels comfortable enough at this point to showcase those capabilities to, if there are any Taiwanese who think that they would be able to they would be able to challenge Chinese sovereignty on this matter. China wants to dissuade them at this very point so that China doesn't have to fight a war at the end of the day. So I think gradually the news is tightening, and particularly I think this idea that in the Indo-Pacific, China remains the dominant player. That's a message that China wants to send out, which means that for India, these developments are very serious. Chinese naval penetration into Indian Ocean is growing by the day, because once China settles Taiwan, which I think it wants to do over the next few years, the focus will be on the Indian Ocean. And there, because once Taiwan comes under control of China, and again, this is not going to be very easy, nor this is going to be uncontested, but Chinese believe that if they are able to gain control over Taiwan Strait, then I think they can certainly dominate the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's the reality that India is facing. How do we plan for that? How do we think about these challenges is going to be one of the core strategic problems for India over the coming years and months.
How do you think India would respond to a clash between China and Taiwan?
I think that would be something that would be contingent on under what context this happens and how China approaches Taiwan. because if it becomes an issue where China is continuously instigating and China perpetrates an open aggression against Taiwan, it would be very difficult for India to ignore it at a number of levels, because this is not going to be simply a question of China taking over a territory. It would be a question of China doing something with Taiwan which will have implications for other territorial disputes in the region. It will have implications for the geoeconomics of the region, given how Taiwan is at the heart of the semiconductor supply chains around the world. And I think the idea that India can sit this out is going to be very challenging, because there will be pressure from the regional powers, there will be pressure from world powers for India to speak out. But of course, contingent on how other countries will also be reacting to it, because there'll be direct implications for India strategically. And so far, we have not seen a very serious debate in India on this matter. But I think it is time that we start to think and plan accordingly, because this is going to be a serious enough challenge for India very, very soon.
What do you think? You just mentioned that there will be some direct implications on India if that situation does occur. And we have Xi Jinping essentially mentioning multiple times. He even mentioned it in his New Year's speech that he vowed the reunification of China and Taiwan. What are the direct implications that you think would be most crucial for India?
I think the direct implication would be that once China, has Taiwan under control, then this, the spread of Chinese power from, the critical, whether it is the critical sea lanes of communication, or whether it is the wider expanse of the Indo-Pacific maritime space, they become very, very visible. And India, of course, as India has been trying to expand its presence in the Pacific, as India has been trying to work with other like-minded countries in the region, will be under tremendous pressure to respond to this challenge, because then there is nothing stopping China to look at its problems with India much more directly. So at this point, hypothetically, in some ways, the focus on Taiwan means, as far as Chinese defense and national security policy is concerned, that Chinese are putting their resources, most of their capabilities, into ensuring that a reunification with Taiwan becomes possible in the short to medium term, which means that they still are not focusing enough on the border problem with India in the Indian Ocean, and how to challenge India's predominance there. Once Taiwan is out of the way, you can imagine the kind of resources that would be available to China, and you can also see how. In some ways, Chinese foreign and security policy would move to other territorial disputes, including South China Sea, East China Sea, and the Himalayan borders, where India will have direct stakes involved. Now, there is, of course, the economic aspect to it as well, that we have seen how China has become, very, very adept at weaponizing the dependencies. We saw how China has dealt with the US, has dealt with India, has dealt with Australia on contentious issues when it comes to economy. It has weaponized trade dependencies. It has weaponized its dominance in the supply chains of critical minerals. And you can imagine, once Taiwan is under control, the whole semiconductor industry, on which the high-end technology, all areas of high-end technology rely, how China would be able to weaponize that as well, and how dependent the world and India would become on Chinese largesse. So I think there are enormous implications here, which we need to think through and we need to plan for.
So how do you think India would respond if, say, a key regional player like the United States requested access to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, or even any Indian Ocean facilities during a Taiwan crisis?
I think it would certainly be contingent on what kind of a crisis that is. See, US and China have had a number of crises around Taiwan Straits for a number of decades, and sometimes it is the Chinese that are dominating. Sometimes it's the Americans that are dominating, and at most of the times it is this is a shadow boxing between the two powers over Taiwan, to demonstrate who is in control and in command of the sea there. And I think if it's like that, then I think India has always in the past been sitting it out, and India has no direct involvement because that becomes a question between US and China. But if it is direct assault on Taiwanese sovereignty by the Chinese, and the Americans come, and of course other countries, American allies come to support Taiwan in some measure, then I think there'll be pressure on India to do something, to do a lot of support, to provide certain kinds of support systems to the US or to the West, and it would be a difficult challenge for India to navigate, given that India is not an alliance partner of the US, and India would not be under a treaty obligation to provide support. But whether the strategic requirements in the region are serious enough for India to pitch in, that's a question that India will have to significantly and clearly think through, because let's also remember that India has its own challenges with China. And if China decides to up the ante there, then would India have the capabilities to protect and defend its interests while at the same time helping others in Taiwan? And I think that would be a critical measure for India. And therefore, some kind of an assessment of what kinds of capabilities India can provide, or India would be in a position to provide, given its own challenges vis-a-vis China, is a question that I think we need to begin to address, because it's not going to be an easy question. It's going to be a question which will be loaded with regard to Indian capabilities, with regard to Indian strategy, and with regard to India's own problems with China, which have been which are growing by the day. We have heard recently how this issue of Arunachal Pradesh has become a major flashpoint, and we have had the U.S. Department of Defense, Department of War report talking about Arunachal Pradesh being a core area of interest for China. Now, one can look at it from an American point of view, but clearly Chinese have been upping the ante on Arunachal for a while. So it's not as if this is news to India. But the question is, therefore, do we balance it out vis-a-vis China, and do we say that, look, we have our own interests, and therefore first order of priority would be that we manage those interests in a manner that does not lead to a all-out conflict with China, or do we also think about other areas like Taiwan or South China Sea, where Chinese ability to dominate is growing, and whether India can, in some ways, participate and in some ways make a difference to the ground realities? I think that's the question India will have to answer.
Speaking about India's own problems with China, if China is engaged in a Taiwan campaign, how likely is it to open a second front along the Indo-China border to pressurize New Delhi?
I think not very likely if Taiwan is the focus, because the focus will be on winning Taiwan. But there is another aspect to it. Let's imagine a situation where Taiwan, for example, becomes a flashpoint, and Taiwan, of course, Taiwan has very strong capabilities. It's not going to be a cakewalk for China if China goes against Taiwan. We have seen how smaller countries like Ukraine can hold off Russia for 4 years. This is so it's not going to be when we talk of conflicts and wars, it's never as simple as saying that one country, one power is powerful and therefore it would dominate. And we know how it was believed that it would be a cakewalk for Russia and Ukraine, and now 4 years down the line, we are still struggling. Russians are still struggling. So, and Taiwanese capabilities are of a high order. Taiwan's geography is very different, and the ability of Taiwanese forces with support from the Western weaponry to hold off Chinese assault is significantly larger. But the point there is that let's imagine a situation that the Chinese are stuck. Now, at that point in time, one can also imagine a situation where there will be enormous pressure on the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping to do something about it, to save face. And whether that can lead to an opening of the second front vis-a-vis India. That's an interesting question to think about, because in some ways Chinese might think that let's do something along the Himalayan borders or along the South China Sea or in South China Sea to demonstrate that they are not failing vis-a-vis Taiwan. And I think that to save face domestically, showing off their growing power capabilities across the board might be an avenue open to them. So I think there are various ways in which the scenarios might play out, but there is no denying the fact that if Taiwan if there is a military challenge in Taiwan Strait, it is going to have implications across the board, whether it is in South China Sea, East China Sea, or whether it is in the Himalayan borders, or whether it will be with respect to China-US relationship, because that would also undergo a fundamental change.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of the other key players in the region, right, when you just mentioned the fact that the Western weapons are going to aid Taiwan if there is a situation where China does plan an invasion there. You have the United States, which is obligated to help Taiwan defend itself. You have Russia and China getting closer and closer as time goes by. Could you explain the other key players that would possibly play a role if this does come to a crescendo between China and Taiwan?
I think the most important player, as you mentioned, is going to be the US, and everyone would be looking at American response, because America has a policy where they would prefer status quo. And which means that neither side disturbs that status quo, and therefore Americans have also put pressure on various Taiwanese governments to ensure that they are not very aggressive, that they are not trying to provoke the Chinese in their own way. The issue is, today we have reached a situation where the Chinese are not being driven by other players. Chinese are being driven by their own rise. Chinese policy is being driven by its own assessment that this is the moment to take on Taiwan. So I think that balance between US and China has changed, and we know also that Mr. Trump, despite talking big, had to capitulate in the end with the Chinese to get the trade deal done, because the Chinese made it very clear that they have complete control over the critical minerals supply chain, and therefore it might seem to the Chinese that Americans, because of multiple pressures that they can put on the economic front, would not be in a position to come to the aid of Taiwan the way they want. But I think the fact remains that if the status quo is disturbed by the Chinese, then America would not be able to sit it out. America will have to intervene in some way, whether it is indirectly or directly. And so America will become a critical player. And once America becomes a critical player, it would be very difficult for other Western countries also to keep away from this. Because again, if you think of Europe, Europe has a very difficult relationship with China today. And Europe would not want to be in a position where China becomes even more dominant. And of course, there is a larger issue of how American allies would respond to this. But the more pressure would be in the Pacific, where you have American allies like Japan, South Korea, and Australia, who would be expected to aid American policy vis-a-vis Taiwan in the case of a military conflict. And there, I think certainly they would be expected to demonstrate what they can do and what they can, how can they directly participate. I don't think that similar pressure would apply on India, because India is of course not an alliance partner to the US. But in the wider context of whether it means providing some indirect support, whether it means creating some set of possibilities where India can distract the Chinese, I think all those possibilities would be on the table. So you have first the America and its Western allies, America and its Pacific allies, and of course America and its broader set of partners, critical partners, Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, those countries with whom America has a direct defense relationship. They would be expected to provide some kind of a support. On the other side, you will of course have China, and to a certain extent, China would expect Russia to give it cover. I don't. It's very difficult to see what Russians can do militarily, but politically, diplomatically, at the United Nations, in various organizations where if this crisis escalates, Russia certainly, it's at this point it's very difficult to see Russians taking a position which is going to be antithetical to the Chinese position.
Especially because they're suffering with their own weaponization arsenal, right? Because they are trying to figure out Soviet-era weapons. That's because they're facing sanctions. They're having an issue with the supply chain of weapons. So,
yes, absolutely. that in that sense, given what has happened in Ukraine and how things have moved from there, Russia-China relationship would mean that even if the Russians are not participating directly, Russians will provide indirect support to China, and China would expect that to happen. Chinese believe that they are or increasingly believe that they are in a position where they themselves dominate the Taiwan Strait. They don't need any military support from anyone else, and they may be right about it. But I think political, diplomatic support certainly they would expect from countries like Russia, but they would also expect that certain countries would remain neutral. And I think that's where the really interesting, aspect would lie, because which countries would decide, a response that would be not taking a side. And I think in that sense, Chinese have enough levers to play with because of their economic dominance particularly in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, where they are the largest trading partners of almost every country in the region. They can very easily, very subtly ensure that countries, even if they may disagree with the Chinese moves, they will not come out and say so. So diplomatically, politically, a cover would be provided to the Chinese by a number of countries. So I think it would be in that sense, Chinese diplomacy would be very interesting to watch because that's what they expect. And there'll be enormous pressure on countries which are not direct alliance partners of the US, of the West, on them about their positions, about what they will or they will not say on this crisis. So I think we are going to certainly Taiwan crisis. If at all it happens in the way that we are envisioning, would have enormous implications for the larger global politics, but also for individual countries in the region and beyond, insofar as their foreign policy priorities are concerned, because there they will not be able to sit it out. There you will have to have a position. If you are neutral, if you are passive, then I think it means that you are siding with the Chinese in some ways, and that certainly would reveal your foreign policy priorities.
Even more so because of the implications of the Belt and Road Initiative, right?
Yes, again, so you are so dependent on China. Many countries are so dependent on China for economic aid, for infrastructure development. Belt and Road Initiative has poured in enormous sums of money across the world, and therefore we have seen that Taiwan does not really have many countries that have direct diplomatic relations. Increasingly, the number has been going down, whatever limited number of countries there have been. And one China policy is the policy of most countries in the world. So diplomatically, for most countries in the world, it would be very safe to say that, look, this is an internal matter of China. China and Taiwan have to resolve it among themselves. And most countries would issue can issue a pro forma statement and move on with it. But I think if it escalates to a military level, the stakes would be so high that certain countries will have to take a direct position on the matter. And particularly, I think countries that have talked of a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, where China is not the dominant player. And I think those countries are technically the most advanced countries, whether you talk in the region, whether you talk of Australia, Japan, South Korea, India, America, and Europe. I think the real action would lie in how they would respond to this challenge, whether they would be in a position to push back against the Chinese, and that therefore and when we are talking about this, it's very clear that this crisis is not going to be a limited crisis, because this crisis will have implications far beyond what may happen in the Taiwan Strait, because every major actor would be involved, and every major actor's priorities and preferences would reveal themselves, which means that a new regional and global order would set itself up in the region, and therefore the kind of pressure on Taiwan that we have seen from China in the last few years is indicative of this trend, that China realizes that this is going to be a very important matter for them, and therefore they need to press and push and demonstrate their capabilities so that they don't have to fight a war. At the end, what the expectation from China is that if they demonstrate their power, if they keep doing these kind of war games that they are doing, if they keep doing these kind of exercises, if they keep putting pressure on Taiwan itself would relent on its own and realize the folly of being a sovereign actor. It would realize that the future lies in reunifying with China China, and the world will also realize that there is no point in pushing back against the Chinese. So I think the demonstration itself and the kind of sophisticated war gaming that they have been doing around Taiwan Strait is itself a message to the world and to Taiwan, which I think Chinese are very cleverly delivering every few months.
Do you think that a Taiwan crisis would accelerate the militarization of the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal? And how do you think that would affect India's naval posture?
See, without any doubt, I think militarization, which is already happening. I mean, if you think of how much Chinese are now invested in the Indian Ocean, the kind of power projection that they are demonstrating in the Indian Ocean, it's very clear that's the next frontier for them, and they believe that they have an opportunity, given the numbers of expanding naval capability that they have, that they can demonstrate their capabilities across the Indian Ocean increasingly. The only challenge for them is that they want to keep the focus on Taiwan for the moment, so that once Taiwan issue is in some ways resolved, they will be freer in projecting that power. But militarization is already happening. We have seen the numbers, maritime capabilities, naval capabilities of countries grow dramatically. China, of course, is leading the fray. And in Bay of Bengal, we have seen how China is gradually becoming the most important power of India's neighbors. Defense partner of India's neighbors. We often forget, we all talk of post Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh, but during Sheikh Hasina itself, China had emerged as the most important defense partner of Bangladesh. So Chinese penetration of India's neighborhood had been growing from Pakistan. Of course, it started long decades back, but now it's all major countries in South Asia have very serious defense partnerships with China. Chinese Navy continues to be present in the Indian Ocean, and of course, India dominates the Indian Ocean because of its geographical position. But how far India would be able to do that, that's a question, I think, seriously, that needs to be addressed, because ultimately it's a question of capabilities. And we have seen how India is today more comfortable partnering with like-minded countries in the region. And therefore, those partnerships that has enhanced India's ability to project a sense of purpose. But by and large, in terms of balance of power, Chinese are in a position to change it rapidly. And once Taiwan is dealt with, the militarization would certainly accelerate, and that militarization of Bay of Bengal or broader Indian Ocean would have some dramatic implications for India. And therefore, we are also looking at enhancing our Indian maritime presence, in Indian naval presence in the region, and we are building those capabilities. But I think in terms of the timeliness of that increase, we need to do much more, because time is not on our side, and therefore a greater strategic clarity is needed as to what kind of capabilities India needs and how fast can we deliver them on the ground, because operationally things are changing fast.
So what's your take on how the Quad would respond to a China-Taiwan conflict?
I think Quad will have to first figure out the Trump question, because we are struggling with Mr. Trump at the moment, and one hopes. I think the hope is that once the India-US trade deal is settled, Mr. Trump would start investing, or America would start investing in the Quad the way he did during his first term, because Trump 1.0 invested in the Quad significantly. But I think at the moment, China would be very happy to see that Mr. Trump is, because of Mr. Trump and what is happening on the India-US front, Quad has taken a back seat. The question is that eventually Quad was never meant to be a security platform. It was meant to be a non-traditional security platform, in the sense that all those issues that were indirectly impinging on the Indo-Pacific were to be taken care of by the Quad, and therefore we saw a very expansive agenda of the Quad that emerged in the aftermath of COVID in particular. I think securitization of the Quad is not something that that would be very comfortable for India, or that would be very comfortable for US at this point. Quad can do things without being said that this is being done by Quad, because US, Japan, and Australia, of course, are alliance partners of each other, and therefore they would work together on any contingency that arises. But India can support as indirectly, because India has defense relationships with Japan, with Australia, with the US on its own without being part of Quad. So, in a sense, what we will see is, if there is a crisis, we will see a disaggregated response from Quad, not as Quad per se, but as different parts of this Quad trying to work and see how far these bilateral and trilateral partnerships can perform there. Because ultimately, the question is whether the four members of the Quad would be willing to upgrade Quad to a level where it is seen as a serious security organization. And I think at this point, it might be a bit too much to ask.
Mr. Pant, thank you so much for joining us and giving us as crucial a perspective on this entire matter as you have.
Thank you so much.